Good evening. That's better. I'm Eugenie Scott. I'm the president of the Bay Area Skeptics. Welcome to the Bay Area Skeptics Monthly SkepTalk. This is a speaker series that we have every month on the second Thursday of the month at 7:30 at La Peña, but you all know that because you are here. We also sponsor a Skeptics in the Pub on the fourth Thursday of every month at Fiddler's Green in Millbrae, except for this month and next month. But ordinarily we have a Skeptics in the Pub on the fourth Thursday of the month. We also sponsor SkepTalk, which is the Northern California affordable conference about science and critical thinking. If you are interested in science and critical thinking and claims of the paranormal and what may possibly be wrong with them, you might consider joining the Bay Area Skeptics and supporting our efforts. Well, our speaker tonight is Lynn Branch, who's the Deputy Director of the National Center for Science Education, which you have been since Hector was a pup. When did you start working there?
1999.
1999. Yeah, that's a long time. You are, I suspect, at this point, the oldest, no, that's not the right word, the longest-serving staff member at NC's. Glenn and I were colleagues there until I graduated to retirement a couple of years ago. If you read Glenn's blog at Science League of America, which you should read the blog post at Science League of America. It's a wonderful blog associated with NCSE. You will doubtless be struck not only by his very dry humor, but by the breadth of his interests in science, philosophy of science, history of science, and any number of things. You might also notice an inordinate fondness for armadillos. At any rate, he is here to talk to us tonight about gems from the quote mine. Would you please welcome Glenn Branch?
Thank you. I turned off my cell phone, which is kind of a shame because the ring on it is a hairy, screaming armadillo doing its thing. I get a lot of weird looks in public. I'm happy, as always, to be talking to Bay Area Skeptics. Tonight, I'm going to be presenting gems from the quote mines. As that reference to quotes might suggest, these slides are going to be a little more text-heavy than we all might like, but please don't strain your eyes reading them. The text is mainly ornamental, and I won't be reading it aloud verbatim anyhow. So, here's a well-known passage from Darwin's Origin of Species. To suppose the eye with this and that and the other, see, I'm not reading it verbatim, to suppose that the eye could have been formed by natural selection seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest degree. That's Darwin. Creationists aren't, by and large, tremendously fond of Darwin, but they're fond of that passage. Indeed, they love to quote it. Even Darwin, they will say, admits that it is absurd, and not just absurd, but absurd in the highest degree, to suppose that the eye could have been formed by natural selection. How ridiculous to accept evolution when even your hero Darwin didn't. Of course, what creationists don't quote is the next 3 pages of The Origin, in which Darwin painstakingly describes a series of plausible intermediate forms between eyelessness and eyefulness, giving examples from existing organisms to show that the intermediary forms would be viable. The creationists don't even quote the next sentence of The Origin. They don't even quote the next word of the next sentence. Yet. This is a representative and exemplary case of a reprehensible practice that has been dubbed quote mining. Those are quote miners hard at work there. The etymology of quote mine is obscure. The term isn't in the Oxford English Dictionary. The quote mine project at the Talk Origins Archive attributes it to a Usenet post in 1996, but that's hardly decisive. I like to joke that the term goes back to the 17th century. Robert Burden, in a preface to his 1621 blockbuster, The Anatomy of Melancholy, explains that he claims no originality for his patchwork of allusion and excerpt. I cite and quote mine authors, he writes. He admits it. If the etymology of quote mine is obscure, so is the exact meaning. Obviously, there's something intellectually dishonest about quoting the Darwin passage about the eye in such a way as to give the impression that Darwin thought that the eye could not have evolved by natural selection. But it's hard to say exactly what's wrong with it. For example, sometimes quote mining is defined in terms of misquotation. But clearly a creationist could quote Darwin accurately, could get the words off the page and onto his own page without error, but still use it in a misleading fashion. Sometimes quote mining is defined as an intentionally dishonest use of a quotation. But it's not plausible to suppose that everyone who quote mines a passage is doing it intentionally, knows that they're misrepresenting the author. Sometimes they do it carelessly and are guilty of, at most, reckless disregard for the truth, which is bad enough to be sure, but it's not intentional. And sometimes quote mining is defined as taking a quotation out of context. Whoops, go back. This fits the case of the Darwin passage about the eye quite well, but it doesn't always work. For example, in The Evolution of Man Scientifically Disproved, a creationist book from 1925, which is my current favorite, the author quotes a whole series of scientists supposedly expressing doubts about evolution, culminating in a quotation from Sir Charles Bell. Everything declares the species to have their origin in a distinct creation, not in a gradual variation from some original type. Now, if you look at the book from which this quotation comes, you'll find that it's accurately quoted, and you'll find that it is not quoted out of context. Bell said that, and Bell meant that. What you will find, however, is that the book was published in 1833, 26 years before The Origin was published, 92 years before Evolution Disproved was published, 182 years before the present day, not exactly bang up to date as a scientific critique of evolution. But for all that, we can give a definition of quote mining that will cover the case adequately, I think. Here we go. Quote mining is quoting or paraphrasing a passage presented as authoritative in such a way as to distort the meaning or significance of the passage. Now, each of those terms needs to be unpacked a little. To fix our minds, let's keep on thinking about that passage from The Origin of Species where Darwin is talking about the eye. First and easiest is quoting and paraphrasing. If there's something dishonest or misleading about quoting the passage from The Origin where Darwin is talking about the eye in such a way as to give the impression that Darwin didn't believe the eye could have evolved through natural selection, then it's just as bad to paraphrase it, to say Darwin said that it was absurd to suppose that the eye could have been formed by natural selection. So from here on out, when I say quoting, I silently mean or closely paraphrasing. Good. Second, presented as authoritative. If someone quoted the Darwin passage about the eye, but added, well, Darwin was mistaken, as it happens, later evolutionary biologists were able to satisfactorily explain how the eye could have evolved through natural selection. If someone did that, they would be misreading Darwin, but they wouldn't be quote mining. A true quote miner would take Darwin to be the last word on the topic, or would use the Darwin passage in the first place. Finally, meaning or significance. Those are terms that might seem to be synonymous, of course. Let me stipulate that the meaning of a passage is a function of the words on the page, while the significance of the passage depends on broader considerations, such as the identity of the author, whether he or she is a scientist or not, for example, or the nature of the publication, whether this is a peer-reviewed scientific journal or an offhand comment, for example, or the date of publication, whether it's bang up to date or 133 years old. Now, the typical use of the Darwin passage by a creationist distorts both its meaning by omitting yet and what follows, and its significance by presenting Darwin as having the last word on the viability of a natural selection explanation of eye evolution. So to help prize those concepts apart, I'll give a couple of further examples. Here is a case where a quote miner distorts the meaning of the passage but not its significance. So here is a widely used quote from James Bryant Conant. He was a chemistry professor and president of Harvard University for 20 years, and a voluminous writer late in his life on education and the philosophy of science. So a real authority at the time when he was writing. This passage is from 1951, although it's a little dated now. So Conant, as you see, is complaining about a grotesque account of a period some thousands of years ago, a fantasia which is neither history nor science. This is commonly claimed to be an indictment of evolution. But when you look at the meaning of it, if you look at the book from which it's quoted, the relevant paragraph begins, "The astonishing popularity of that fantastic book, Worlds in Collision, shows how eagerly the reading public welcomes the repudiation of the findings of modern science." Conant isn't talking about evolution at all. He's talking about Immanuel Velikovsky's cockamamie views about the miracles of the Old Testament depending on impossible astronomical phenomena. Now here, for contrast, is a case where a quote miner distorts the significance of the passage but not its meaning. The creationist Harry Rimmer, who you see up there, in a book called Monkey Shines, quotes a noted authority, W.P. Barbelian, as expressing pride in his evolutionary heritage. Barbelian says, "I like to think that I was once a magnificent hairy fellow living in the trees, and that my frame came down through geological time via sea jelly and worms and amphioxus, fish, dinosaurs, and apes. Who would exchange these for the pallid couple in the Garden of Eden?" Rimmer says, I would rather 1,000 times trace my descent up to God through Adam than down to a sea jelly through wormy ancestors whose children were apes. I don't know where the dinosaurs get into it. Not related. When I read that about a year ago, I was actually a little surprised because I knew the name W.P. Barbelian. I knew that Rimmer omitted one of the initials. It should be W.N.P. Barbelian. I even knew what the initials stood for. Wilhelm Nero Pilate. Yes, that's Wilhelm as in Wilhelm II, who many people blame the First World War on. Nero, as in Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, the first century Roman emperor who persecuted Christians and supposedly fiddled while Rome burned. And of course, Pilate, Pontius Pilate, the first century prefect of the Roman province of Judea, who according to the Gospels presided over the trial of Jesus and ordered him to be crucified. It wasn't his real name. Barbelian was born Bruce Frederick Cummings in 1889. He took his new surname from the name of a sweet shop, although it does sound like barbarian and rebellion, so he liked it for that reason. But the rest of his name was taken because he regarded Wilhelm, Nero, and Pilate as the most miserable of men. And Barbelian knew all about misery because he was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis tragically young in 1915 and died of it in 1919. Now, Barbelian left behind him diaries that he started keeping when he was 13 years old, published as the Journal of a Disappointed Man, because he died so young. And it's from those diaries, not any scientific publication, that Rimmer took that quotation about the pallid couple in the Garden of Eden. It's true that Barbelian was a budding scientist. He worked for 4 years on 3 insect orders in the British Museum of Natural History. He had a lot of promise, but he was not an authority on human evolution, and his diaries are not where he presented his scientific research. So the significance, if not the meaning, of the quote from Barbelian was distorted. Now, notice, by the way, that I'm not building anything about dishonesty or intention into the definition of quote mining here. Distorting the meaning or significance of a quoted passage is a bad thing in itself. It's worse, certainly, when it's committed intentionally than when it's committed with reckless abandon, and we can judge quote miners accordingly. But on the definition of quote mining I'm proposing, they're guilty of the same basic action, just as someone who commits murder and someone who commits homicide are. Note also that on this definition, mere sloppiness, that's a pretty fancy sloppy Joe there, mere sloppiness with quotations doesn't count as quote mining. There, see? They're often associated, of course. They're both terrible, bad habits for a scholar to have, but they're not the same thing. For example, simple typographical errors. In The Evolution of Man Scientifically Disproved, my favorite book, William Williams writes, Dr. Tross, a famous paleontologist, concludes, the idea that mankind has been descended from any simian species whatever is certainly the most foolish ever put forth by a man writing on the history of man. Well, Dr. Tross couldn't have been that famous because, as it turns out, Williams was talking about Oscar Frost with an F rather than a T. At least 3 other contemporary creationists made the same mistake, probably all copying the error from a common source in 1917 that I found. Well, that's not so bad. T's and F's look pretty similar. But sometimes the sloppiness can get quite extreme. In After Its Kind, another Scopes Era creationist book, Byron Nelson wrote, Darwin said, I imagine that probably all organic beings which ever lived on this earth descended from some primitive form which was first called into life by the Creator. Now, reading this, not long after I had been reading everything that Darwin ever wrote on the origin of life, which took about 10 minutes because he didn't write very much about it, I was perplexed. I didn't recognize these words at all. Darwin wrote something kind of similar to the same effect in the last chapter of The Origin, but not those words. You'll like this. It turns out that Nelson was not quoting Darwin's Origin. He was quoting The History of Creation, a translation into English of Ernst Haeckel's Natürliche Schöpfungsgeschichte. I spent 5 minutes practicing that, thank you. And Haeckel had quoted from the German translation of Darwin's Origin of Species. So Nelson, rather than quoting Darwin, quoted a translation of Darwin, which seems needlessly roundabout. Of course, sloppiness doesn't have to be only in the words, it can be in the attribution. And I want to take you quickly through a long journey I took trying to figure out a particular sloppy attribution, just because it's so cool. We can start with Luther Tracy Townsend's Collapse of Evolution from 1905. As Ron Numbers, the great historian of creationism, notes in his book, Townsend assembled one of the earliest and most frequently cribbed lists in order to prove that the most thorough scholars, the world's ablest philosophers and scientists, with few exceptions, are not supporters, but assailants of evolution. And as a result, whenever I start to investigate a quote from a scientist of a particular vintage, I know to go look at Townsend because he probably started it. So in Townsend's book, there's an endnote that attributes a claim to the geologist Charles Lyell. In the year 1806, he says, the French Institute enumerated not less than 80 geological theories which were hostile to the scriptures, but not one of these theories is held today. Here's Lyell, who was a lawyer by training. At first glance, there's not much to worry about here. Lyell was certainly a leading geologist. He was a professor of geology at King's College in the 1830s. He was a little young to take note of anything in 1806, the year in which he turned 9, but he could have certainly learned about an enumeration of 80 geological theories hostile to the scriptures at some point later. And of course, the idea that geologists change their minds over time with new evidence and new data is not really surprising in any case. But the problem emerged when I tried to locate this claim in Lyell. Lyell isn't exactly Darwin, with a minor scholarly industry devoted to unpacking and disseminating every word, but it's not hard to find Lyell's major writings. I looked through all of them, and guess what? No such claim is to be found in Lyell. And yet it was kind of hard to believe that Townsend would have made up the quotation out of whole cloth. There's something about the specificity of the year 1806 and the number 80 geological theories that carries a certain degree of conviction. In the event, I discovered a likely source for the quotation and a likely reason why it was misattributed to Lyell. In 1840, This fellow on the screen here, Albert Barnes, who was a well-known Presbyterian minister and expositor of the Bible, gave a series of lectures that was then published as The Progress and Tendencies of Science. Barnes was concerned to argue, quote, "It is the tendency which is observable in all science to become tributary to revelation and to confirm the great historical facts and doctrines of the Christian religion." And he addresses and dismisses various arguments to the contrary from astronomy, from archaeology, from linguistics, before he turns to geology. And what Barnes says is, in 1806, the French Institute counted more than 80 such theories hostile to scripture history, not one of which has stood to the present time. That's recognizably the quote from Townsend, although Townsend tinkered with it a little. But how did Townsend, reading Barnes, get the idea that this had anything to do with poor old Charles Lyell? Well, at the end of the paragraph in Barnes' book, there's a reference to Lyell's geology. But Barnes is talking about a bunch of different things in that big, long paragraph. And when you track down the reference in Lyell, you'll find that Lyell is talking about something else. He's talking about the paleontological record for humans. Barnes wasn't citing Lyell for evidence for these 80 theories. So, okay, where did Barnes get the 80 theories from? Well, he stole it. In Nicholas Wiseman's 12 lectures on the connection between science and revealed religion, there is a very purple passage. From the time of Buffon, system rose beside system, like the moving pillars of the desert, advancing a threatening array, but like them they were fabric of sands, and although in 1806, you know the story. This, by the way, is the same Wiseman who became Archbishop of Westminster when the Catholic Church hierarchy was reestablished in Britain in 1850. And as you see, Barnes plagiarized the portion from System to Sand in his book, I'm sorry to say. Okay, so where did Wiseman get the 80 theories? It turns out that he got them, and I still haven't figured out quite how. He got them from this fellow, Georges Cuvier, the great French zoologist who established the scientific disciplines of paleontology, establishing convincing evidence of extinctions as he did so, and of comparative anatomy. So in 1806, and there's that year, Cuvier drafted a report of the Institut National on a book about geology that had been submitted for its approval. And in its preface, he complained about the state of modern geology. Thus, the number of geological systems has increased to the point that today there are more than 80 of them, he complains. Notice that he does not describe them as hostile to the scriptures, nor did he think so. So there's a distortion of meaning here that would qualify this for quote mining status, even if the misattribution of Lyell wouldn't. Okay, so back to quote mining. Do we need a definition of, now that I've given you one, do we need a definition of quote mining at all? Well, of course, we could proliferate different terms for the different phenomena here. We could distinguish between misquotation, quotation out of context, anachronistic quotation, and so forth, and dispense with the term quote mining altogether. But I think there can be a case made that there's a unifying essence behind quote mining that really does call for a definition. And I think we can see it best if we approach the phenomenon of quote mining a little obliquely, by situating it in a broader context, that of how science deniers try to rationalize their positions. And this is going to be a little tricky because I'm going to ask you to imagine something. And since I'm addressing an audience of, not to put too fine a point on it, skeptics, it's going to be difficult. I'm going to ask you to imagine that you are not in agreement with a long-standing, well-supported, uncontroversial principle accepted by the scientific community. It doesn't matter, for my purposes, what principle that is. You can suit yourself. You can imagine, if you like, that you think that different species of living things were separately created, as in the well-known painting by Raphael. Or you can imagine that you think that pouring hundreds of gigatons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere has no effect on the Earth's climate, perhaps because carbon dioxide magically loses its ability to trap heat over time, as this climate change denier graph would seem to suggest. Or, what the heck, you can imagine that you think that the Earth is a nice, smooth plane rather than an absurd rotundical affair. Okay, are you gritting your teeth and trying? Imagining that you don't accept evolution or anthropogenic global warming or the spirituality of the earth or what have you? Now, when you're imagining that, are you also imagining that you feel uncomfortable about it? Not necessarily. You might be imagining also, say, that you're an ancient Greek philosopher like Anaxagoras, who thought that the earth was flat, or maybe an isolated Amazonian tribesperson. If you don't know that you disagree with the scientific consensus, then you have no reason to feel uncomfortable about it. But if you do know that you're not in agreement with the scientific consensus on some important point like this, then will your lack of agreement make you nervous? It ought to, but it might not. You might dismiss the claimed consensus, that is, as irrelevant or invalid or not existing. So, first, you might think that the scientific consensus is simply irrelevant to the particular area of science where you find yourself in disagreement. Some creationists, like Norman Geisler, who we see here, divide science into operation science and origin science. They then relegate everything in science they don't like, including evolution, the age of the earth, etc., to the category of origin science, and they dismiss all of origin science as unreliable, except when guided by divine revelation. That's one way to say that the scientific consensus is irrelevant because science just actually can't talk about where you disagree. Other creationists take a slightly different tact here. Instead of saying that there is no evidence for evolution because it's in the dubious category of origin science, they acknowledge that evidence. They acknowledge, to quote one of them, Todd Wood, whom you see here, that there is evidence for evolution, gobs and gobs of it. It works, and it works well. Science, for these creationists, is at least capable of addressing the issue. But they add that, at least for them, the truths of the Bible override that evidence. Science isn't authoritative on the issue. Well, you might not think that either of these ways of dismissing the scientific consensus on evolution is particularly appealing. Certainly I don't. Explaining exactly what's wrong with them is a difficult and mainly philosophical exercise, which I'm going to spare you. I'll just say this. Like many philosophical views, it's easier to see that something's wrong than to put your finger on exactly what's wrong with it. This is why, by the way, when you see paintings of philosophers, like Raphael's School of Athens, the philosophers are shown as having their fingers free. That's Plato on the left, Aristotle on the right. So instead, you might, and we're still imagining that we're science deniers, right? Instead, you might relieve your discomfort by supposing the consensus, though genuine, is invalid. And you might, for example, claim that the consensus is founded on a hoax. Creationists are fond of pointing to the Piltdown hoax. There's some of the people who are involved in the Piltdown discoveries. The Piltdown man, of course, was a hoax composed of a human skull and an orangutan jaw, stained to give the appearance of antiquity and planted in a gravel pit in East Sussex, thus confusing paleoanthropology successfully for decades. While climate change deniers are fond of citing a reference in a climate scientist's email to Mike's Trick, where Mike is the climatologist Mike Mann of Penn State. These cases aren't parallel. Mike's Trick wasn't a magician's sleight of hand, a way of hoaxing the data. It was a mathematical technique, a trick of the trade for plotting recent instrumental data along with reconstructed historical data. So there was no genuine hoax there. Piltdown was a genuine hoax, by contrast, although it was a hoax that was revealed by evolutionary scientists, not creationists. Either way, thinking that scientific consensus is founded upon a hoax ignores consilience, the 19th century philosopher William Whewell's name for the way in which scientific principles are established not on single pieces of evidence, but by the convergence of multiple independent lines of evidence. E.O. Wilson is a fan, by the way. So scientific principles don't depend on a single thin strand of evidence like the sword of Damocles, and they're not doomed when a single strand snaps. Rather, scientific evidence tends to come in mutually reinforcing strands, which makes it suitable for powerful and enduring structures like evolution, or climatology, or old iron sites. If there was nothing more to the evidence for evolution or climate change than Piltdown or the northern tree ring data on which Mike's trick were applied, then maybe the hoax allegation would hold water. But it doesn't. Unless, what if all the evidence supporting evolution or climate change or the shape of the Earth is hoax all the way down, which would require a conspiracy? Thus, for example, a sitting U.S. senator has alleged that the hoax of climate change has been put across, in the words of the subtitle of his book, The Global Warming Conspiracy, which threatens our future. My favorite conspiracy involves the idea that the National Academy of Sciences has a sinister scheme to teach our children that they're descended from reptiles. I myself would take strong exception to such a scheme because the traditional class Reptilia includes all modern amniotes, which are not mammals or birds, making it a paraphyletic group. Our children should be taught to think in monophyletic terms. Thank you very much. So we should be teaching our children that modern so-called reptiles are their cousins and that we're all descended from a common amniote ancestor. This is not the solution that the author of Sowing Atheism has in mind, however. Be that as it may. Conspiracy theories, which are dotty in general, are especially implausible for science, where the culture is to reward and not stifle successful innovation. The idea of a conspiracy theory for climate change in particular founders on the ancient question, cui bono, who benefits? As the author Scott Westerfield has offered, flawed idea. 97% of the world's scientists contrive an environmental crisis, but are exposed by a plucky band of billionaires and oil companies. This brings us to the last way to relieve your science denial discomfort. And this is to argue that there is not, in fact, a scientific consensus, despite the claims to the contrary. And how better to do that than to produce scientists who don't accept evolution or anthropogenic global warming or the shape of the Earth. And here again, there are two main ways of doing it. First, by manifesto or petition. Creationists and climate change deniers both like to assemble lists of scientists who doubt evolution or climate change. This, for example, is the Discovery Institute's Dissent from Darwinism statement, boasting some 800 signatories by now. And here's a signature card for the global warming petition, sometimes called the Oregon petition, with some 9,000 signatories by now. These are two examples out of many possible, of course. Faced with a petition or a statement like this, there's plenty of room to nitpick. These lists often contain non-scientists, for example, such as Bugs Bunny, or long-dead scientists from generations past, or scientists whose speciality is irrelevant to the topic. They're often phrased in such a way as to suggest a very minimal commitment. You're skeptical of Darwinism, and then deployed to you in a more expansive and pernicious way. These scientists doubt evolution. Examples of ways to nitpick could be multiplied, but these problems are trivial when compared to the elephant in the room. You can see that if you squint, I think. And that elephant is named Steve. In 2003, NCSE, where I work, debuted Project Steve, in which scientists were asked to endorse a firm statement on evolution and creationism. For evolution against creationism, right? But not every scientist was eligible to sign the statement. Only one's named Steve. And cognates like Stephanie and Esteban and Etienne and Esteban. Only those Stevoids were eligible. The Project Steve list, which as of yesterday has 1,380 signatories, dwarfs the creationist lists. And since only about 1% of the US public has a Stevoid name, those 1,380 signatories scale up to 138,000 scientists. There really is a scientific consensus on evolution. The existence of a few vocal outliers is not evidence against that consensus, especially when they're unfortunate by and large not being named Steve. Less entertaining, but equally effective, is work in which scientists are surveyed or their articles in the scientific research literature examined. For both evolution and climate change, the level of consensus among scientists is thus revealed in the high 90s, 97% or higher for both. This is a robust result that persists from study to study and in studies using different methodologies and approaches. I don't know of a study on the shape of the Earth, though. So the manifesto, or statement, is, as I say, one of two ways of trying to show that there is not a scientific consensus. The other is using the words of scientists themselves, which is easier in some ways, right? You don't have to recruit them to sign a petition or pen a manifesto. But, of course, since there really is a scientific consensus on evolution and on anthropogenic global warming, and even on the shape of the Earth, this really can be a hopeless endeavor, which is why it degenerates quickly into quote mining in its various forms. So that was a quick overview of the various ways of how, if you disagree with a long-standing, well-established, uncontroversial scientific principle, you might try to deal with that fact, and where quote mining fits in the taxonomy of ways to do that. So you can see why quote mining is appealing to a science denier, whether a climate change denier, a creationist, a flat earther. Is a cheap and easy way to dispute the claim that there really is a scientific consensus against you. Of course, quote mining can occur in non-scientific contexts. It's not limited to science denial, but my point is that there's a special appeal to it for science deniers. Indeed, a lot of creationist books consist basically of quote mines with a little connective text in between them. There are even books that dispense with the connective text altogether and consist entirely of misleading quotations, such as Henry M. Morris's That Their Words May Be Used Against Them, subtitled Quotes from Evolutionists Useful for Creationists. But here's a question. If you generally agree with me, as I hope you do by now, that quote mining is a reprehensible and rather tawdry practice that science deniers engage in an effort to dismiss the scientific consensus with which they disagree, why should we care? What harm does it do to let the climate change deniers blow off a little steam, or the evolution deniers create a stir by mining a few quotes here and there? Well, for one thing, there's the feelings of the scientists themselves. The paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould, who developed the idea of punctuated equilibria with Niles Eldredge, said that it is infuriating to be quoted again and again by creationists who misinterpreted punk-eek as confirming one of the longest standing lies in creationism, that there are no transitional forms in the fossil record. Sometimes this infuriation arrives slowly. In 1955, the chemist Homer Jacobson wrote an article for American Scientist discussing experimental work on the origin of life, then in its infancy. Two passages in particular caught the attention of creationists because they seem to say that the conditions for life all had to be simultaneously present at the time of life's birth, and that this was utterly impossible. He was duly quote-mined. So in 2007, that is 52 years later, Jacobson wrote to American Scientists requesting the retraction of those two passages from his article. The first passage, he said, was merely a conjecture, and he now thought it was possible that the conditions required for life could have arisen separately. The second passage, he said, was based on a mistaken assumption that a molecule would have to form spontaneously from its components. Those were the reasons that those passages should be retracted, Jacobson told the journal. But his motivation, he explained, was the continued irresponsible contemporary use of those passages by creationists. As for himself, he said, I am deeply embarrassed to have been the originator of these misstatements, allowing bad science to have come into the purview of those who use it for anti-science ends. So there's the quote mine scientists feeling to consider, but the harm done by quote miners is more widespread, because creationists and climate change deniers, not so much flat earthers these days, don't keep their views to themselves. They try to affect public policy. So quote mining has the potential to affect us all. In 2002, to take an example from my own career, Ohio was revising its state science education standards. Enter the Discovery Institute's Center for the Renewal of Science and Culture, the de facto institutional home of intelligent design creationism. This is an outfit that has rebranded itself over the years. When it was started, its website banner looked like this, with the creation of Adam from the Sistine Chapel. Now, this was entirely appropriate, in my view, since the president of the Discovery Institute explained that the center seeks, quote, to replace materialistic explanations with a theistic understanding that nature and human beings are created by God. Adam was subsequently replaced with the double helix of DNA, but the explicit religiosity of Michelangelo's image belied the center's disavowal of any religious motivation, and the banner was eventually replaced. The replacement featured a planetary nebula, presumably selected because it looks a bit like an eye, a favorite icon of creationists from William Paley onward. So these were the folks who were presenting the Ohio State Board of Education with what it called a bibliography of supplementary resources, consisting of a list of scientific publications that supposedly represent dissenting viewpoints that challenge the prevailing theory of evolution, and so forth. They might have well called it the latest gems from the quote mines. Working at NCSC, I personally then spent a busy week sending a questionnaire to the authors of every publication listed in the bibliography, hearing back from 26 scientists representing 34 of the 44 publications. So what did I ask them? I asked them, among other things, does your work provide scientific evidence for intelligent design? Those who said yes, 0. Those who said no, 26 out of 26. Some of them were quite indignant at the suggestion. Doug Irwin of the Smithsonian said that it would require a deliberate and pernicious misreading of his work to form that conclusion. I also asked them, does your work provide scientific evidence against evolution? Those who said yes, 0. Those who said no, 26 out of 26. Some of them were positively baffled at the suggestion. Kenneth Weiss at Penn State said that evolution is beyond dispute based on all the evidence that he knows of, and moreover, that he said as much in the publication cited by the Discovery Institute. After a week of doing this, I felt like Woody Allen's character Alvy Singer in Annie Hall. You'll remember Alvy Singer hearing someone inaccurately pontificating in public about Marshall McLuhan's work, has McLuhan on hand to contradict him. You know nothing of my work. It was just like that, only 26 times. The Ohio Board of Education ended up ignoring the Discovery Institute, which pleased me mightily. I'm from Ohio myself. So, quote mining is not only a reprehensible and misleading practice, it can be actively dangerous in undermining attempts to establish public policy that accords with the scientific consensus. I'm fascinated with quote mining because it's often amusing and informative to debunk it, and because it casts light on the thought processes, such as they are, of science deniers. But it's also my business to deal with it, because, as I'd like to remind you, I work for the National Center for Science Education, which defends the integrity of science education against ideological interference, from creationists, from climate change deniers, and even from devotees of the electric universe. Don't ask about the electric universe. Don't. So for students, parents, teachers around the country, NCSC serves as a kind of crisis clinic. That's the office there. And if you want to help us keep creationism and climate change and the electric universe, no, really, don't ask. If you want to help us keep pseudoscience like this out of science education, we welcome and appreciate your support. Thank you.